The November rain fell soft against the white headstones of Arlington National Cemetery. Each drop seemed to carry the weight of memory, of promises made and kept, of brotherhood forged in fire and tested by time. Colonel James Hartmann stood alone before a fresh grave, his weathered hands clutching a pair of dog tags that no longer belonged to anyone living. 68 years had carved deep lines into Jim's face, lines that spoke of desert suns and midnight vigils, of decisions that saved lives and mistakes that ended them. His dress blues hung perfectly on shoulders that had carried the burden of command for over 3 decades. But today, those shoulders seemed to sag under an invisible weight that no uniform could straighten. The headstone before him read simply, Colonel William Patterson, beloved friend, faithful Marine, devoted teacher. The dates beneath told of a life well lived, 82 years from birth to rest. But they did not tell the story that mattered. They did not speak of the man who had saved Jim's son while Jim himself had frozen in fear. They did not mention the friend who had spent his final days ensuring that a lesson learned in blood would not be forgotten. Jim's fingers traced the engraving of Bill's name. The stone was cold. Everything was cold. He pulled a photograph from his pocket, edges worn from handling. 2 young men in desert camouflage, arms around each other's shoulders, standing before an M1 Abrams tank. Kuwait, 1991. A lifetime ago. A different war. Different men wearing the same faces. Behind him, the sounds of the cemetery faded into background noise. Other mourners visiting other graves. Other stories of sacrifice and service. But for Jim, there was only this moment. This grave. This reckoning with a promise made 21 years ago and kept at the cost of his best friend's peace. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a second photograph. This one more recent. Bill in a hospital bed, thin and worn by the cancer that had finally claimed him. But his eyes still held that spark, that fierce determination that had defined him. In the photo, Bill was pointing at something off camera. Jim remembered what it was. A documentary script. Their final mission together. I'm sorry I couldn't save you, brother, Jim whispered to the stone. I tried. God knows I tried. The wind picked up, scattering leaves across the manicured grass. Somewhere in the distance, a bugler played taps for another fallen warrior. The mournful notes seemed to echo Jim's own grief, giving voice to the hollow ache in his chest. But I kept my promise, he continued, voice stronger now. The documentary is done. It premieres next week. Everyone will know. They'll understand what we learned, what you helped me learn. He placed the dog tags on the grave marker. They had belonged to Bill, worn through 2 wars and carried into retirement. Bill had pressed them into Jim's hand 3 days before he died, his grip surprisingly strong for a man so wasted by disease. Make sure they learn, Jim. Make sure they understand. We can't keep paying in blood for the same lesson. That had been Bill's final order. And Jim had never disobeyed an order from Bill Patterson, not in 33 years of friendship, not even now when Bill was beyond caring whether the order was followed. The rain intensified. Jim made no move to leave. Let it fall. Let it wash over him. Some stains ran deeper than water could reach. His mind drifted back, as it so often did these days, to the beginning, to the moment when everything changed, to the day when his pride and his certainty and his unshakable faith in perfection had nearly cost him everything that mattered. March 19th, 2003, the night before his battalion deployed to Iraq. Jim had been 47 then, a lieutenant colonel with a spotless record and an unshakable confidence in American military superiority. He remembered standing in his study, surrounded by books on military history, tactical manuals, and a shelf dedicated entirely to World War II armor warfare. His specialty, his passion, the subject he had studied for over 20 years. On his desk lay the operations order for the coming invasion. His battalion, 3rd of the 8th Marines, would spearhead the assault toward Baghdad. 58 M1 Abrams tanks, the most advanced main battle tanks in the world. Proven in Desert Storm, undefeated in combat, unstoppable. The plan was perfect. Jim had spent weeks refining it, coordinating with intelligence, logistics, air support. Every contingency accounted for, every risk mitigated, every detail checked and double-checked. It was a masterpiece of military planning, a textbook example of how to employ superior technology with overwhelming force. His wife Sarah had stood in the doorway watching him work. Even now, Jim could picture her face, the worry in her eyes, the tension in her shoulders. You're bringing him home, right? She did not need to say who she meant. Their son, First Lieutenant Marcus Hartmann, 24 years old, West Point graduate, tank platoon leader, eager, untested, desperate to prove himself worthy of the Hartmann name. Jim had looked up from his papers, met his wife's eyes, and smiled with the confidence of a man who had never failed at anything that mattered. We have the best tanks in the world, Sarah. The best training, the best plan. Nothing can touch us. The words echoed now across 21 years. Nothing can touch us. The arrogance of it, the blind, foolish certainty. Sarah had nodded, wanting to believe, needing to believe. But her eyes had said what her mouth could not. Please don't let your confidence kill my son. Jim blinked away the memory, the rain mixing with tears he had not realized he was shedding. At Arlington, standing before Bill's grave, he could admit what he had never allowed himself to acknowledge then. He had not been confident, he had been terrified, and he had hidden that terror behind planning and preparation and an unshakable faith in technology. The M1 Abrams was the best tank in the world. That part was true. But the best tank in the world meant nothing if the man commanding it forgot that war was not fought on paper, but in blood and chaos and the terrible uncertainty of combat. A voice spoke behind him, gentle but firm. Colonel Hartmann? Jim turned. A young Marine stood at attention, dress blues, perfect, eyes respectful. The cemetery escort, no doubt, checking on the old man who had been standing in the rain for too long. I'm fine, son, just saying goodbye to an old friend. The Marine nodded, understanding. How many scenes like this had he witnessed? How many aging warriors standing vigil over the fallen? Take your time, sir. Just wanted to make sure you were okay. After the escort departed, Jim turned back to the grave. He had more to say, more that needed to be spoken aloud, even if only the dead could hear. Do you remember that night, Bill? March 19th, 03? You came to my quarters, brought that bottle of whiskey, said we needed to talk. The memory unfolded with crystal clarity. Bill had sat across from Jim at the small desk, 2 glasses between them, the whiskey bottle already half empty. The amber liquid caught the lamplight, throwing shadows across the tactical map spread between them. The air smelled of Kentucky bourbon and the peculiar scent of fresh ink on military documents. Outside, the sound of tank engines idling in the motor pool rumbled like distant thunder. Bill had always been able to drink Jim under the table, said it was his Irish heritage. Jim had suspected it was just practice. I'm worried about you, Jim. Jim had looked up from his planning documents, irritated at the interruption. His fingers were stained with red pen from marking corrections on the ops order. Worried? Bill, the plan is solid. Intel is good. We're ready. Bill had taken a long drink, the ice clinking against the glass, staring at the amber depths rather than meeting Jim's eyes. That's not what I'm worried about. Then what? Bill had set down his glass with a soft thunk against the wooden desk and finally looked up. For just a moment, his mouth quirked into that half-smile Jim knew so well. You know, your grandfather would have liked this whiskey. Old tankers always appreciated the good stuff. Despite his irritation, Jim felt a ghost of a smile. He left me that journal, didn't leave me his liquor cabinet. Smart man, you'd have drunk through it worrying about this operation. Bill's smile faded and the intensity in his gaze stopped Jim cold. I'm worried that you've forgotten what war actually is. You're treating this like a chess match. Like if you just plan perfectly enough, think through every move, account for every variable, then nothing can go wrong. But that's not war, Jim. War is chaos. War is Murphy's Law on steroids. War is the moment when your perfect plan meets reality, and reality doesn't give a damn about your plan. Jim had bristled at the criticism. I know what war is, Bill. I was in Desert Storm, same as you. I know what it's like when the shooting starts. Do you? Because Desert Storm was a cakewalk. We had total air superiority. We outnumbered them 10-1. Their equipment was obsolete. Their training was garbage. We could have won that war with Shermans and good tactics. The Abrams just made it easier. What's your point? Bill had leaned forward, voice dropping to just above a whisper. My point is that you've spent 20 years studying how the Germans lost World War II because they built Tiger tanks instead of more Panzer IVs. You've written papers about how they fetishized quality over quantity, how they built technological marvels they couldn't support in the field, how they waited for perfect conditions that never came while the Allies just kept coming with good enough equipment in overwhelming numbers. You know all of this. You teach this, And now you're about to make the exact same mistake. Jim had stood up, anger flashing. That's completely different. We're not the Germans. We have the logistics. We have the support. We have the training. And we're not building Tigers. We're using equipment that's proven, reliable, and superior to anything the enemy has. Bill had remained seated, unmoved by Jim's anger. The equipment isn't the problem, Jim. You are. Your plan calls for us to wait, to establish perfect logistics, to get complete intelligence picture, to coordinate with every adjacent unit until everything is synchronized like a Swiss watch. You want to roll into Iraq with overwhelming force and zero risk. That's the Tiger mentality. That's fighting for perfection instead of fighting to win. I'm fighting to bring my men home alive. Are you? Or are you fighting to bring Marcus home alive? The question had hit like a physical blow. Jim had sunk back into his chair, the anger draining away, replaced by something colder and more dangerous, fear. He's my son, Bill. I know, and that's why I'm worried. You're not planning this operation like a battalion commander. You're planning it like a father. You're so terrified of losing him that you're trying to eliminate every possible risk. But you can't, Jim. Risk is part of war. And by trying to create perfect safety for Marcus, you might be creating perfect danger for everyone else. The conversation had gone on for another hour. Jim had defended his plan. Bill had poked holes in it. Not in the tactics themselves, but in the assumptions behind them. The belief that the enemy would cooperate with American timelines. The faith that logistics would flow smoothly. The certainty that intelligence would be accurate and complete. By the time Bill had left, the bottle was empty, and Jim's certainty had been shaken, but not broken. He had spent another hour reviewing the plan, looking for flaws, and finding none. The plan was good. Bill was just being paranoid. Everything would be fine. Standing in the rain at Arlington, Jim wanted to reach back through time and shake that younger version of himself. Wanted to scream at him to listen to Bill, to understand what his friend was really saying. But time moved in only one direction, and the past was written in stone as permanent as the grave markers surrounding him. The rain began to ease. Gray clouds parted enough to let through pale November sunlight. Jim checked his watch. He had been standing there for over an hour. Sarah would be worried. She always worried when he spent too long dwelling on the past. But he was not quite ready to leave. There was one more memory he needed to revisit. One more piece of the story that had to be acknowledged before he could move forward. He pulled out a small, leather-bound journal from his jacket. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting old-fashioned and careful. His grandfather's journal. Sergeant Thomas Hartmann, Sherman Tank Commander, 2nd Armored Division, World War II. Jim had found this journal when he was 18, home from basic training, exploring his grandmother's attic. She had died the year before, and his father was cleaning out the house. Jim had opened an old footlocker, and there it was. His grandfather's war. Thomas Hartmann had died when Jim was 5. Jim's memories of him were fragmentary. A tall man with kind eyes. Rough hands that were gentle when they ruffled Jim's hair. A quiet presence who rarely spoke about the war. Just another veteran who had done his duty and come home and tried to forget. But the journal remembered. The journal held everything Thomas had been unwilling to say aloud. And it had shaped Jim's entire life, his entire career, his entire understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. Jim opened the journal to a page he had read 1,000 times. The handwriting here was shakier than elsewhere, as if written in great emotional distress. The date at the top read December 20th, 1944. Found another Tiger II today. Germans call it Königstiger. King Tiger. The name fits. Massive thing. Must weigh 70 tons. Armor so thick our shells bounced off like pebbles. Guns so powerful it could have killed us from a mile away. But it was abandoned, pristine, not a scratch on it. Just sitting there in the snow like a steel monument to futility. Our translator, Corporal Weinstein, found a note inside. German crew had left it. He read it to us. Das Perfektion hat uns getötet. Perfection has killed us. We all laughed, figured it was just bitter Germans making excuses for losing. But now I'm not so sure. We've been finding these Tigers everywhere. Abandoned, out of fuel, broken down, waiting for parts that never came. The Germans built the best tank in the world, and it's losing them the war. Meanwhile, we're driving Shermans. They're not the best. They're not invincible, but there's thousands of them, and they work, and they're here, and that matters more than being the best. Jim remembered the first time he had read those words. He had been so excited. Here was proof of what he already believed, that American pragmatism defeated German perfectionism, that good enough beats perfect if good enough shows up, that technology without logistics is just expensive junk. He had written his senior thesis at the Naval Academy on this exact subject, had built his entire tactical philosophy around it, and then somehow, somewhere along the way, he had forgotten his own lesson. He had become the thing he studied. He had become the German planners who built Tigers when they should have built more Panzer IVs. But there was another entry in the journal, one that Jim had not appreciated until much later, until after Iraq, until after the mistakes and the consequences and the terrible knowledge that came from surviving while better men died. Jim flipped forward a few pages. December 25th, 1944, Christmas Day. The handwriting here was nearly illegible, written quickly, probably in poor light, definitely in great pain. Lost Mike today, Sergeant Mike O'Brien, best friend I ever had, known him since basic. We came over together, fought through France together, promised each other we'd make it home together. Today I broke that promise, not because I wasn't brave enough, not because I wasn't skilled enough, because I wasn't smart enough to say no. Our battalion commander, Colonel Hastings, is a good officer. West Point, knows all the doctrine, plans everything down to the last detail. He ordered us to hold position 3 days ago, said we'd wait for ideal conditions to attack. Air support, artillery prep, fresh supplies, perfect intelligence. Everything synchronized. But the Germans didn't wait for our schedule. They hit our flank this morning, caught us sitting still. Mike's tank took a direct hit. He never had a chance. None of them did. 4 good men dead because we were waiting for perfect conditions that never came. I wanted to hate Hastings for it, but I can't. He was trying to protect us, trying to give us every advantage, trying to make sure we all came home. His mistake wasn't malice, it was pride. The pride of thinking he could plan away the chaos of war, the pride of believing that perfect preparation equals perfect results, the pride of forgetting that the enemy gets a vote. Tonight I made a promise. If I survive this war, I'll never let anyone under my command die waiting for perfection. I'll never sacrifice lives for plans. I'll never forget that war rewards action, not intention. Mike deserved better. They all deserve better. And if there's a next generation, if my sons or grandsons ever wear this uniform, I pray they learn this lesson without paying the price I paid today. Jim closed the journal carefully, reverently. His throat was tight, his vision blurred, because now he understood, really understood. His grandfather had left him this journal not as a tactical manual, but as a warning that Jim had read but not comprehended, a warning that had been written in blood 79 years ago and that Jim had ignored because he thought he was smarter, better prepared, more capable than the men who came before. The rain had stopped completely now. Pale sunlight illuminated the rows of white stones, turning the cemetery into a field of quiet monuments to American service. Jim looked at Bill's grave, then at the journal in his hands, then at the sky above. You tried to warn me, Bill, you and Grandpa both, but I didn't listen. I thought I was different, thought I had it figured out, thought my love for Marcus and my faith in technology and my perfect planning would somehow break the pattern. But war doesn't care about patterns. War doesn't care about plans. War only cares about what's real and what's not. And my perfect plan wasn't real, it was fantasy dressed up as doctrine. He knelt down, placed the journal beside the dog tags on Bill's grave. I'm keeping my promise, brother. The documentary tells the whole truth. My mistakes, my arrogance, the men who died because I thought I was smarter than history, and the lesson that you spent your last months making sure would finally be learned. Rising to his feet took effort. His knees ached. Everything ached these days. The price of age and old injuries and a lifetime of carrying weight that could not be set down. But there was work yet to do. A premiere in 7 days. A documentary that would expose his failures to the world. A final accounting that would honor the dead by ensuring their sacrifice meant something beyond just one man's education. Jim took one last look at Bill's grave, committing this moment to memory. The rain on stone, the silence of the dead, the weight of promises kept and broken and renewed. Then he turned and walked away, back toward the parking lot, back toward the living world, back towards the work that remained. Behind him, the journal lay on the wet grass beside the dog tags. On its cover, barely visible in faded gold leaf, were the words, Sergeant Thomas Hartmann, 2nd Armored Division, Hell on Wheels. 3 generations of tank commanders. 3 different wars. 1 lesson, written over and over in blood until someone finally learned it. The wind picked up again, ruffling the pages of the open journal. If anyone had been there to read them, they would have seen Thomas Hartmann's final entry, written on May 8, 1945, the day Germany surrendered. The war is over. I'm coming home. But Mike isn't, and that will haunt me until I die. I kept my promise, though. Never waited for perfect again. Fought hard, fought smart, but always fought forward. Lost good men anyway. That's war. But I didn't lose them to my own pride. That's something. To whoever reads this, whenever you read this, remember, the best weapon is not the one with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. The best weapon is the one that's there when you need it. The best plan is not the one with 0 risk. The best plan is the one you can execute before the enemy executes theirs. The best officer is not the one who never loses men. The best officer is the one who doesn't lose them for nothing. War is hell, but pride is worse. Pride dresses itself up as excellence and discipline and proper preparation, and then it gets good men killed. Don't let it. Fight your enemy, fight the case, fight the fear, but don't fight for perfection. Perfect doesn't exist, and men who chase it don't come home. The pages fluttered closed. The cemetery fell silent again. And somewhere in the distance, a bugler played taps one more time for warriors who had earned their rest. But for Jim Hartmann, there would be no rest yet, not until the promise was kept, not until the lesson was learned, not until the next generation understood what 3 generations had paid to teach them. He reached his car and sat behind the wheel without starting the engine. His phone showed 17 missed calls. Sarah, Marcus, the documentary production team, all worried about where he had gone, but he needed one more moment, one more memory before he could move forward. March 20th, 2003, the day his perfect plan met reality. His battalion had crossed into Iraq with the initial invasion force, 58 M1 Abrams tanks. The pride of the Marine Corps, the cutting edge of American armored warfare, unstoppable, invincible, perfect. Jim's plan called for a deliberate advance, wait for complete intelligence, establish robust logistics, coordinate with adjacent units, move forward only when all conditions were optimal. Textbook combined arms doctrine, nothing left to chance. And for the first 3 days, it worked. His battalion advanced steadily, encountering minimal resistance, suffering 0 casualties. Jim's confidence grew with each successful phase line crossed. See, he told himself, patience pays off, planning matters, perfection is possible. On day 4, March 23rd, the plan began to unravel. Other Marine and Army units were advancing faster than anticipated. The Iraqi military was collapsing more quickly than intelligence had predicted. The entire timeline was accelerating. Units were bypassing resistance, pushing hard for Baghdad, trying to end the war quickly before it could bog down into urban warfare. But Jim's battalion remained tied to the original plan. They were supposed to reach Phase Line Delta on March 27th. Not before, not after. That was the plan. That was the coordination timeline. That was perfection. Bill had come to his command vehicle on the evening of March 23rd. Jim could see him now as clearly as if it were yesterday, dust-covered, exhausted, frustrated. Jim, we need to accelerate. The entire division is moving. We're going to get left behind. Jim had studied the map, the timeline, the logistics reports. We're exactly where we're supposed to be, on schedule, on plan. The plan has changed, Jim. The situation has changed. We need to adapt. We need to stick to the plan. That's what plans are for. That's why we spend months developing them. So we don't get caught up in the case and make stupid mistakes. Bill had stood there, jaw clenched, fighting to control his frustration. Jim, listen to me. Really listen. The enemy is repositioning. Every day we sit here, they're figuring out where we're going. They're preparing. They're turning our plan into their advantage. We have to move now while we still have surprise, while they're still off balance. We move on the 27th as planned. You're making a mistake. I'm being disciplined. There's a difference. Bill had left without another word, and Jim had told himself he was right, that Bill was being rash, that patience and planning would prove superior to reckless aggression. For 3 more days, Jim's battalion sat in position, maintaining security, running patrols, waiting for the perfect moment to execute the perfect plan. And with each passing day, the Iraqi defenders had time to observe, time to prepare, time to turn Jim's predictability into their opportunity. March 27th, 0400 hours. The battalion began its advance toward phase line Delta and the approaches to Baghdad. 0530, first contact. The enemy had known exactly where they were coming, had prepared ambush positions, had placed their limited armor assets in hold-down defensive positions, had positioned RPG teams in buildings along the route, had done everything possible to turn American strength into American casualties. Because Jim had given them 6 days to prepare, 6 days to watch, 6 days to plan, 6 days gifted by Jim's pursuit of perfection. The battle had been case. Hatas. Radio calls overlapping, units taking fire from multiple directions. The perfect plan disintegrating into confusion and fear and the desperate struggle to survive. And in the middle of it all, Marcus's voice on the radio. Thunder 6, this is Thunder 2-1. We've been hit. Mobility kill. Track is gone. We're immobilized. Jim's world had stopped. Everything else faded. All the planning, all the doctrine, all the perfect preparation, none of it mattered. Only one thing mattered. His son was stuck in a kill zone. Thunder 2-1, this is Thunder 6. Sit tight, we're coming for you. But getting to Marcus meant breaking the plan, meant stopping the advance, meant bunching up units, meant exposing flanks, meant doing everything the doctrine said not to do. And Jim had hesitated. For perhaps 10 seconds, he had hesitated, torn between the plan and his son. 10 seconds that felt like hours. 10 seconds during which his perfect plan and his love for his son went to war in his mind. Bill had been in the command vehicle with him, had seen the hesitation, had understood instantly what it meant. Jim, give the order. If we stop, we lose momentum. We'll be sitting ducks. If we don't stop, your son dies. Give the order. And Jim had. He had ordered the battalion to halt, to orient on Marcus's position, to extract him immediately. He had broken his perfect plan to save his son, and in doing so, he had created exactly the situation he had spent months trying to avoid. A stopped armored column, units out of position, perfect targets. The Iraqi counterattack had been swift and brutal. RPGs, mortars, small arms fire from buildings. Even a few T-72 tanks that had been held in reserve, waiting for exactly this kind of opportunity. The next hour had been hell, pure distilled hell. Jim's carefully orchestrated advance had become a desperate fight for survival. Units were separated, communications were breaking down, casualties were mounting. And Jim had watched it happen, knowing that every wounded Marine, every destroyed tank, every moment of chaos was his fault. His pride, his certainty that he could plan away the fog of war. Sitting in his car at Arlington, Jim closed his eyes against the memory of what came next. The radio calls, the casualty reports, the terrible arithmetic of combat. Thunder Actual, this is Steel 2. We've taken a direct hit. Vehicle is burning. Crew is bailing out. 3 wounded. One didn't make it. Thunder Actual, Iron 4. We're taking heavy fire. Request immediate support. Thunder Actual, this is Paladin 6. My gunner is down. He's hit bad. We need medevac now. The voices kept coming. Young men, scared men, dying men, all of them paying the price for Jim's perfect plan. It was Bill who had saved them. Bill who had taken tactical command when Jim froze. Bill who had organized the defense, coordinated the counterattack, gotten the battalion moving again. Bill who had led 3 tanks to Marcus's position and extracted him under fire. By the time the sun set on March 27th, Jim's battalion had accomplished its mission. They had reached phase line Delta. They had defeated the Iraqi defenders. They had advanced toward Baghdad. The operation was a tactical success. But 4 Marines were dead. 12 more were wounded. 7 M1 Abrams tanks were destroyed or abandoned. And Jim's faith in perfection had died alongside them. The names were burned into his memory, would be there until the day he died. Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, Corporal James Jenkins, Private First Class Anthony Washington, Pvt Kevin Chen, ages ranging from 19 to 34, all dead, all gone, all because Jim thought he could achieve perfection through planning. He opened his eyes, back in the present, back at Arlington. The steering wheel was wet. He realized he was crying again. After 21 years, the tears still came. Probably always would. His phone buzzed, a text from Sarah. "Where are you? Marcus is worried. Call me." Jim took a deep breath, wiped his face, started the engine. Time to go home. Time to face his family. Time to prepare for the documentary premiere that would tell the world what kind of officer he had really been. But as he drove through Arlington's gates, passing row after row of white stones, he thought about Thomas Hartmann and Mike O'Brien, about Bill Patterson and his dying wish, about Rodriguez, Jenkins, Washington, and Chen. And he thought about Tiger II, the German super heavy tank, the pinnacle of World War II armor design, the most powerful, most protected, most sophisticated tank ever built, and a strategic disaster that helped lose Germany the war. Because Tiger II was perfect, and perfection, Jim had learned at terrible costs, was the most dangerous enemy a warrior could face, more dangerous than any opponent across the battlefield, because the enemy could only kill you, but perfection could make you kill your own. The documentary would tell that story, would trace the line from Tiger II in 1944 to M1 Abrams in 2003, would show how the same mistake, the same pride, the same worship of perfection had killed men across 60 years, would prove that the most important lessons are the ones we refuse to learn until we pay for them in blood. Jim drove through the Virginia suburbs, headed home to Sarah and Marcus in the next chapter of this long, painful story. Behind him, Arlington receded in the rearview mirror, but the lessons written on those white stones came with him, would always come with him, were written on his soul in letters that would never fade. The best weapon is the one that's there. The best plan is the one you can execute. The best officer is the one who learns from the dead instead of joining them. Those were the truths purchased with American blood. Those were the lessons 3 generations had paid to teach. And if Jim had anything to say about it, there would not need to be a 4th generation. The pattern would end. The cycle would break. The price had been paid in full. All that remained was to make sure the lessons stuck, to ensure that Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen and Bill Patterson and Mike O'Brien and all the others had not died for nothing, that their sacrifice would mean something beyond grief and regret. That was Jim's mission now, his final operation. And unlike his perfect plan in Iraq, he would not fail, could not fail. The dead deserved better. The rain began again as he pulled into his driveway. Sarah stood at the door, worry etched on her face. Marcus's truck was parked in front. They had both come to check on him, to make sure he was all right, to remind him that he had not lost everything, that some things had survived his mistakes. Jim sat in the car for one more moment, watching them through the rain-streaked windshield. His wife, his son, both still here, both alive, both proof that even catastrophic mistakes could be survived, if not forgiven. He thought of the journal still lying on Bill's grave, thought of the words his grandfather had written, thought of the promise that had been passed down through 3 generations of Hartmann tank commanders. Never again. Never let pride kill good men. Never worship perfection over pragmatism. Never forget that war is chaos and planning is merely a hope that chaos will be kind. Then he opened the car door and stepped out into the rain, ready to face his family and his past and his future. Ready to keep the promise. Ready to finish what Bill had started and Thomas had begun all those years ago in the snow of the Ardennes. The weight of perfection had broken him once, had killed good men, had nearly destroyed everything he loved. But from that breaking had come understanding, and from that understanding had come wisdom. And from that wisdom would come, he hoped, a lesson that would save the next generation from paying the same price. The Iron Covenant. That was what Bill had called it. The promise that each generation of warriors would learn from the last, that the dead would teach the living, that the price paid in blood would purchase wisdom for those who came after. Jim walked toward his house, toward his family, toward the work that remained. Behind him, thunder rumbled across the Virginia sky. Ahead, light spilled from the windows, warm and welcoming and alive. And in his heart, the names of the dead whispered their approval. Keep the promise, they said. teach the lesson, make it mean something. And Jim Hartmann, who had learned the hard way that perfection was not worth the price, walked into that light determined to do exactly that. The conference room at the National Press Club held 300 seats. Everyone was filled. The air conditioning hummed quietly, fighting against the body heat of the packed audience. Camera crews lined the back wall, their lenses pointed at the large screen dominating the front of the room. The smell of coffee and anticipation hung in the air, that particular scent of nervous energy in formal gatherings. Outside, a late November storm battered Washington, D.C., rain hammering against the tall windows. But inside, the air was thick with held breath and the quiet rustle of programs being opened, paper whispering against paper in the dimmed light. Jim Hartmann stood in the wings, watching the crowd assemble. Journalists, military historians, active duty officers, veterans from 4 different wars, and scattered throughout, faces he recognized. Men who had been there, men who knew the truth because they had lived it. In the front row, Sarah sat beside Marcus. His son wore his dress blues, the silver oak leaves of a lieutenant colonel gleaming on his shoulders. 45 years old now. Battalion commander himself. The weight of command had added lines to his face that made him look older than his years. Jim understood. Command aged you faster than time ever could. Bill's widow, Helen, sat 3 rows back. 80 years old, but still sharp, still present. She had insisted on coming, despite the pain it would cause to watch her husband's final work unveiled. Bill had spent his last 6 months working on this documentary with Jim, had pushed through chemo sessions to conduct interviews, had dictated notes from his hospital bed when he was too weak to hold a camera. The house lights dimmed. A hush fell over the room. Jim felt his pulse quicken. 21 years had led to this moment. 21 years of living with guilt and understanding and the desperate need to make the deaths mean something. The documentary's title appeared on screen in stark white letters against black. The Iron Covenant. 3 generations learned the price of perfection. And below it, smaller, in memory of Bill Patterson, who taught us that wisdom matters more than victory. The first image was one Jim knew by heart. A Tiger II, German King Tiger, sitting abandoned in snow-covered forest. The narration began in Bill's voice, recorded months before he died, when his voice still had strength. This is a story about the most dangerous enemy a warrior can face. Not bullets, not tanks, not the opposition across the battlefield. The most dangerous enemy is the one inside. The belief that perfection is possible. The faith that planning can eliminate chaos. The pride that says we can do better than those who came before. The screen shifted to footage of M1 Abrams tanks rolling through a rocky desert. This is also a story about 3 generations of American tank commanders. A grandfather who fought Tigers in World War II, a father who commanded Abrams in Iraq, and a son who learned from both. It's about the lesson that keeps getting written in blood because each generation thinks it's different, smarter, better prepared, above the mistakes of history. Jim watched the screen, but in his mind he was back in Iraq. March 27th, 2003, 0530 hours. The moment when his perfect world shattered. The documentary cut to interview footage. Jim on camera, older, grayer, but with eyes that held hard truths. The interview had been filmed 6 months ago, in the same room where his grandfather's journal now rested in a climate-controlled case. I was so sure, documentary Jim said, voice quiet but clear. I had studied the German mistakes, had written papers on how they lost because they built Tigers instead of more practical vehicles. I knew the history, I taught the history, and then I became the history. The screen split. On one side, technical drawings of Tiger II. On the other, schematics of M1 Abrams. The similarities were more striking than the differences. Both designed for maximum protection. Both mounting the most powerful guns of their era. Both complex. Both maintenance-intensive. Both expensive. Both designed for a kind of warfare that assumed technology could overcome chaos. Bill's narration continued. The Germans built 489 Tiger IIs between January 1944 and March 1945. They were the most powerful tanks in the world. Nothing could penetrate their frontal armor. Their gun could destroy any Allied tank at ranges over 3 kilometers. They were perfect, and they lost the war. Footage of Tiger II interior, the cramped fighting compartment, the complex transmission, the fuel tanks that held hundreds of gallons but emptied faster than supply lines could refill them. Perfection came at a time. Each Tiger II took 350,000 man-hours to build. Compare that to a Sherman, which took 10,000 hours. For every Tiger II, the Allies could build 35 Shermans. The Germans had quality, the Allies had quantity. Guess who won? Jim watched the audience. They were leaning forward, taking notes. Some of the older veterans were nodding, recognition on their faces. They knew this story, had lived versions of it in Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm. The documentary shifted gears. Archival footage from World War II. American soldiers examining abandoned Tiger IIs. The narrator, speaking over the images, was Jim's voice now. My grandfather, Sergeant Thomas Hartmann, encountered 17 abandoned Tiger IIs during the Battle of the Bulge. Not destroyed, abandoned, out of fuel, broken down, waiting for parts that never came. He wrote in his journal, "The Germans built the best tank in the world, and it's costing them the war." The screen showed pages from Thomas Hartmann's journal, the handwriting clear enough to read on the large screen, the entries about Mike O'Brien, about waiting for perfect conditions, about the promise made on Christmas Day, 1944. My grandfather learned a lesson in that Belgian snow. Excellence without sustainability is just expensive failure. He promised that if he survived, he would never let anyone under his command die waiting for perfection. He kept that promise for the rest of his military career, and he left his journal as a warning to future generations, a warning I failed to heed. The documentary did not shy away from Jim's failure. It showed the operational plan for the Iraq advance, showed the timeline, showed how Jim's battalion had sat in position for 6 days while other units pushed ahead, showed how the enemy had used that time to prepare. Combat footage appeared. Grainy, shaky, real. The chaos of March 27th, tracers cutting through dust, explosions. Radio chatter overlapping in confusion and fear. And then, the casualty reports. The screen went black. 4 names appeared in white text. Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, Corporal James Jenkins, Private First Class Anthony Washington, Pvt Kevin Chen. Birth dates, death dates, photos in dress uniforms, young faces that would never age. Bill's voice returned, softer now. These men died because their commander forgot the lesson his grandfather had paid to learn. They died because pride and fear and love got tangled up with doctrine and planning. They died waiting for perfect conditions that the enemy had turned into an ambush. The documentary could have ended there. Could have been just another cautionary tale about military mistakes. But Bill had insisted on more. Had insisted on showing the parallel with Tiger II, on making clear that this was not just one man's failure, but a pattern that repeated across generations. The screen showed new footage. A warehouse. The camera moved through aisles of military equipment until it stopped at a massive shape under canvas covers. Slowly, the covers were pulled away to reveal a Tiger II. Complete. Pristine. The same one that sat in the Fort Benning Museum. Jim's voice narrated. This is serial number 280040. It was captured intact in Bavaria in June 1945. Not destroyed in combat, not disabled by mechanical failure, simply abandoned because the crew had no fuel. It had traveled less than 200 kilometers from the factory. It never fired a shot in anger. The most powerful tank in the world, and it contributed nothing to Germany's war effort except consuming resources that could have been used elsewhere. The camera moved around the Tiger II, showing details. The thick armor plates, the massive gun, the complex suspension. The engineering marvel that represented both the peak of German technical achievement and the nadir of German strategic thinking. The Germans knew they were losing. By the time this tank was built, the war was effectively over. But they kept building Tiger IIs anyway. Kept pouring irreplaceable resources into weapons that couldn't be sustained in the field. Kept pursuing perfection when adequacy would have served them better. Why? The question hung in the air. The documentary let it breathe. Then Bill's face appeared on screen, filmed in his hospital room, oxygen tube in his nose, but eyes clear and sharp. Pride, Bill said simply. They couldn't admit that good enough was good enough. Couldn't accept that sometimes you need 100 okay solutions more than you need one perfect solution. So they kept building Tigers, kept telling themselves that quality would overcome quantity, kept believing that their technical superiority would somehow reverse the tide of the war, and they lost. Not despite their excellence, but because of it. The documentary transitioned to modern footage: Afghanistan, dusty roads, American military vehicles, and several M1 Abrams tanks, massive and powerful, sitting immobile beside the road. Jim's narration. This footage was taken in August 2010. These Abrams were abandoned during a tactical withdrawal, not because they were destroyed, not because they were outnumbered, because recovering them would have taken more resources than they were worth. Because in that environment, with those logistics challenges, the best tank in the world became a liability instead of an asset. The parallel was clear. The audience saw it. The journalists were writing furiously. The veterans were nodding with the grim understanding of men who had lived this truth. Bill's voice again. We're about to show you something that has never been shown publicly before. Footage from March 2003. Combat camera footage from Jim Hartmann's battalion. What you're about to see is difficult to watch, but it's necessary, because this is what happens when we forget the lessons written in our grandfather's blood. Jim had fought against including this footage, had argued that it was too raw, too personal, too painful, but Bill had insisted. And in the end, Jim had agreed, because without seeing the consequences, the lesson was just theory, just words. The documentary needed to show what pride looked like when it wore uniforms and commanded tanks and got young men killed. The screen showed the interior of a command vehicle. Jim, 21 years younger, staring at a map. Radio chatter in the background. Urgent voices reporting contact, requesting support, calling for medevac. And Jim, frozen, paralyzed by the realization that his perfect plan was falling apart. Then Bill's voice, off camera but clear. Jim, give the order. Young Jim shook his head. If we stop, we lose momentum. If we don't stop, your son dies. Give the order. The camera caught Jim's face in that moment. The terrible choice written in every line. Plan or son, doctrine or family. The impossible math of command where every answer was wrong and not choosing was itself a choice. All units, halt advance, orient on Thunder 2-1. We're extracting the disabled vehicle. The relief in young Jim's voice was audible, but so was the knowledge of what that decision would cost. The documentary showed what happened next. The counterattack, the casualties, the desperate fighting, all of it consequence of a choice made in fear disguised as prudence. When the combat footage ended, the screen showed present-day Jim again. Older, wiser, marked by what he had seen and done and failed to do. I broke my perfect plan to save my son, and in doing so, I created exactly the situation I had spent months trying to avoid. 4 men died, more were wounded. We accomplished our mission, but the cost was higher than it should have been. Higher than it needed to be, because I had waited for perfect conditions instead of adapting to real conditions. The documentary paused. Let the weight of that admission settle. Then it shifted to a different interview. Marcus Hartmann, speaking from his own command experience. My father saved my life that day, but he's carried the guilt of those 4 deaths for 21 years. I've watched him wrestle with it, watched him try to make sense of it, watched him slowly understand what his grandfather was trying to tell him through that journal. And I've learned from both of them, learned that the hardest part of command isn't making the right decision. It's making any decision at all when perfect isn't an option. New footage appeared, recent, filmed in Eastern Europe. Marcus's battalion, M1 Abrams of the latest variant, maneuvering through terrain that looked nothing like the deserts where the tank had been designed to fight. Forests, hills, close quarters, not the open tank country where American doctrine said armor should operate. Jim's narration returned. Last summer, my son faced his own crisis of command. Enemy forces maneuvering, intelligence uncertain, logistics stretched, and a decision that had to be made without perfect information. He could wait for ideal conditions, or he could act on good enough information and hope it was sufficient. He knew what I had done in Iraq, knew what it had cost, and he chose differently. Marcus appeared on a screen again, his voice steady and sure. I remembered my grandfather's journal, remembered my father's mistake, remembered that war doesn't wait for perfect. So I didn't wait either. We moved with the information we had, adapted when that information proved wrong, and kept moving forward. Not because I was braver than my father, but because I learned from him, learned from his failure. That's what makes this bearable. That's what gives meaning to those 4 deaths in Iraq. They taught me. Through my father's pain, They taught me what not to do. The documentary showed the result. Marcus's operation had been successful. 0 friendly casualties. Mission accomplished not through perfect planning, but through aggressive adaptation and willingness to accept good enough as sufficient. Bill's voice, recorded in his final weeks, carried weight that went beyond the words. This is the covenant. Each generation learns from the last. The dead teach the living. The mistakes of the past become the wisdom of the future. But only if we're willing to admit the mistakes, only if we're honest about the pain, only if we stop worshiping at the altar of perfection and start embracing the messy reality of good enough. The screen showed a progression of images. Tiger II abandoned in snow, Sherman tanks rolling through German towns, Thomas Hartmann's journal, the 4 fallen Marines from Iraq, Marcus leading his battalion in Europe, a visual representation of lessons learned and passed down and finally understood. 3 generations of Hartmann tank commanders, 3 different wars, 3 different tanks, but one lesson written over and over until someone finally learned it. Perfection is the enemy. Sustainability is the goal. Being there matters more than being best. And pride kills more warriors than bullets ever will. The documentary moved into its final section, interviews with veterans from across American military history. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, Afghanistan, all of them telling versions of the same story. Equipment that was too good to risk, plans that were too perfect to change, pride that masqueraded as discipline until it got people killed. A Vietnam veteran, 75 years old, spoke directly to camera. We had the best helicopters, the best firepower, the best technology, and we lost. Not because our equipment failed, because we failed to understand that technology doesn't win wars. People win wars. And people need equipment they can sustain, tactics they can adapt, and leaders who are humble enough to learn from mistakes instead of repeating them. A Gulf War veteran, Jim's contemporary, added his perspective. Desert Storm was perfect for Abrams. Open terrain, inferior enemy equipment, total air superiority. We couldn't lose. But that perfection made us cocky, made us think that technology and planning could solve every problem. So when Iraq Part 2 came around, some of us forgot that war is chaos, forgot that the enemy adapts, forgot everything our grandfathers had learned about staying flexible instead of staying perfect. The documentary circled back to Bill, filmed just weeks before he died. His voice was weak, but his message was strong. I'm dying, cancer from burn pits in Iraq. The war is still killing me 20 years later, but I'm at peace because I know this documentary will outlive me, will teach the lesson I spent my career trying to teach, will honor the men who died by making sure their deaths mean something. Bill paused, gathering strength. To every young officer who watches this, to every commander who thinks they can plan away the chaos, to every warrior who believes their technology makes them invincible, learn from us, learn from our mistakes, learn from our dead, because if you don't, you'll just add your own dead to the list. And the cycle will continue, the pattern will repeat, and Jim Hartmann's grandson will be making a documentary about your failures, teaching your great-grandchildren the same lesson we're teaching you now. The screen faded to black. Text appeared. The names of the 4 Marines who died in Iraq, their photos, their ages, their hometowns, and below each name a single line. Staff Sergeant David Rodriguez, age 34, Denver, Colorado, died so others might learn. Corporal James Jenkins, age 23, Mobile, Alabama, died so others might learn. Private First Class Anthony Washington, age 21, Chicago, Illinois, died so others might learn. Pvt Kevin Chen, age 19, San Francisco, California, died so others might learn. More text appeared. In memory of Colonel William Patterson, USMC retired, who spent his final days ensuring these deaths would not be in vain. In honor of Sergeant Thomas Hartmann, 2nd Armored Division, who wrote the warning in 1944 that his grandson finally learned in 2003. And in hope that the next generation will learn from blood already spilled instead of spilling their own. The lights came up slowly. For a long moment, no one moved. No one spoke. The weight of what they had witnessed pressed down like a physical force. Then, from somewhere in the middle of the audience, someone began to clap. Not the polite applause of a finished presentation, but the slow, measured clapping of respect and recognition. Others joined. The applause built. Within seconds, the entire room was standing. 300 people on their feet, honoring not just the documentary, but the men whose stories it told. The men who had died. The men who had learned. The men who were now teaching. Jim stood in the wings, tears streaming down his face. Sarah had found him, was holding his hand, was crying herself. Marcus stood on his other side, dress uniform perfect, bearing military, but eyes wet with emotion he made no effort to hide. Helen Patterson sat in her seat, hands folded in her lap, face serene. She was not clapping, did not need to. Her husband's final mission was complete. The promise he had made to Jim was kept. The lesson was taught. Bill could rest now. The applause continued for 5 minutes. 10. When it finally began to fade, a hand went up in the audience. A young Marine, 20-something, dressed blues, marking him as active duty. "Colonel Hartmann, sir, may I ask a question?" Jim stepped to the podium at the front of the room, composing himself, forcing his voice to steadiness. "Of course. Sir, I'm a tank platoon leader. Just got my first command 6 months ago. I've studied all the doctrine, done all the schools. I know the book. But after watching this, I'm wondering if the book is wrong. If everything I've been taught is just setting me up to make the same mistakes you made, how do I know when to follow the plan and when to throw it out?" The question hung in the air. Jim looked at Marcus, at Sarah, at Helen. Then he looked back at the young Marine. "That's the right question, Lieutenant. And the answer is going to frustrate you. You never know for certain. War is case. Command is uncertainty. Every decision you make will be based on incomplete information and imperfect understanding. The book gives you a starting point, not an ending point. The doctrine gives you a framework, not a solution. Your job is to know when the framework fits reality and when reality demands you break the framework." Jim paused, choosing his words carefully. "My grandfather knew when to break the rules because he had paid attention to what happened when others followed them blindly. I didn't know because I was so confident in my planning that I forgot to pay attention to reality. My son knows because he learned from my failure. The pattern you see, each generation had to learn, but each generation had the option to learn from their predecessor's blood or spill their own. I chose wrong. Marcus chose right. Which will you choose?" Another hand went up. Older officer, probably 40, major's insignia. "Sir, with respect, this documentary makes it sound like planning is bad, like we should just wing it and hope for the best. But every successful military operation in history has involved careful planning. How do we balance the need for preparation with the need for flexibility?" Jim nodded. The question showed the man was thinking, not just absorbing. "Planning isn't bad, Major. Bad planning is bad, and perfect planning is impossible. The Germans planned meticulously for Tiger II. They knew exactly how much fuel it would need, how many spare parts, how many support vehicles. Their planning was excellent. Their problem was that the plan assumed perfect logistics in the middle of a war where logistics were collapsing. They planned for the war they wanted instead of the war they had." Jim gestured to the screen, where the final image of the documentary still lingered. "I did the same thing in Iraq. My plan was sound. My preparation was thorough. My problem was that I built a plan that required perfect conditions and then acted as if perfect conditions were guaranteed. The enemy didn't cooperate. Reality didn't cooperate. And my plan, which looked beautiful on paper, became a trap that got men killed." He looked around the room, making eye contact with as many people as he could. Good planning means building flexibility into your plan. Means having contingencies for when things go wrong. Means understanding that your plan is a hypothesis that battle will test, not a script that battle will follow. The Marines have a saying, "No plan survives first contact with the enemy." That's not a criticism of planning. It's a reminder that plans are tools, not solutions. And a tool that you're afraid to modify or abandon when it's not working is a tool that will get you killed. Questions continued for another hour, some tactical, some philosophical, some from veterans sharing their own stories of plans that failed or succeeded. Jim answered them all, drawing on 21 years of reflection, on his grandfather's wisdom, on Marcus's success, on Bill's teaching. Finally, the moderator called time. The crowd began to disperse, but slowly. People lingered in clusters, discussing what they had seen, arguing about implications, processing the weight of the lesson. Several approached Jim directly, wanting to shake his hand, to share their own experiences. to connect the documentary to their own service. An elderly man, easily 80, wearing a World War II veteran cap, worked his way through the crowd to reach Jim. His handshake was firm despite his age. "I was there," the old man said simply. "Bulge, 2nd Armored. I saw those tigers your grandfather wrote about. Saw them sitting perfect and pretty and useless while we just kept coming. Your grandfather was right. We didn't win because we were better. We won because we were there." Jim felt a lump in his throat. "Thank you for your service, sir, and thank you for being here today." The old veteran nodded. "Your grandfather would be proud. You learned the lesson, maybe too late for some, but not too late for all. That's what matters. The teaching, the passing it down, making sure the next crop doesn't have to learn it all over again in blood." He patted Jim's arm and moved away, leaving Jim standing in the slowly emptying room, surrounded by Sarah and Marcus and Helen, feeling the weight of what had just happened beginning to settle. The documentary was out, the lesson was taught, the promise was kept, but the work was not done. This was just the beginning. The documentary would be posted online, would be shown at military schools, would be required viewing for officer candidates, would reach thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of young warriors who needed to hear it. And maybe, just maybe, some of them would learn from Jim's mistakes instead of making their own. Maybe some of them would remember Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen. Maybe some of them would choose adaptation over perfection and save lives that would otherwise be lost. That was the hope. That was the covenant. That was why Bill had pushed so hard in his final months to get this done. Why he had insisted on the combat footage, the personal failures, the unflinching honesty about cost and consequence. Because anything less would have been another kind of lie, another kind of pride, another way of saying we know better than history when history kept proving otherwise. Helen approached, moving slowly, leaning on a cane she had not needed 6 months ago. The grief of Bill's loss had aged her visibly, but her eyes were clear, her voice steady. "He would have loved this, Jim, loved seeing his work reach so many people, loved knowing that it will keep teaching long after both of you are gone." "I wish he could have seen it," Jim said. "He did," Helen replied. "He saw it every time you two worked on it, every interview you conducted, every piece of footage you reviewed, every word of narration you wrote. He knew what it would become, knew it would work. That's why he could let go, because the mission was accomplished." She reached up and touched Jim's face, a gesture of affection and understanding. "You kept your promise to him, to those 4 Marines, to your grandfather. Now keep the last promise. Keep teaching, keep reminding, keep making sure that this lesson, this terrible, expensive lesson, doesn't have to be learned again." Jim nodded, not trusting his voice. Helen patted his cheek once more and turned away, supported by her daughter, leaving Jim standing with his own family. Marcus spoke first. "I need to get back to base tomorrow, but I wanted to tell you, what you did today, what you and Bill built, it's already changing how I train my officers, how I think about planning and flexibility. You've given me a framework that makes me better at what I do, made me better at keeping my Marines alive. That's worth everything, Dad. Everything." "I just wish it hadn't taken 4 deaths to learn it," Jim said. "I know, but that's the nature of war. Someone always pays the tuition. The question is whether we're smart enough to learn from their payment or whether we insist on paying again ourselves. You've made it possible for others to learn from Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen. That's not nothing. That's everything." Sarah linked her arm through Jim's. "Come on, let's go home. You've done enough for today. The documentary is out. The lesson is taught. Now you get to rest." But rest felt impossible. Jim's mind was already racing ahead to the next phase. The documentary would air on military television networks next month, would be available online immediately, would be required viewing at Marine Corps University, would reach the War College, the staff colleges, the officer candidate schools, would become part of the curriculum for training the next generation of American warriors. That was good. That was necessary, but it was not sufficient because documentaries were easy to ignore, easy to watch and nod and say, "That's interesting," and then forget when the real pressure of command hit. Jim needed to do more, needed to ensure that the lesson stuck, that it became part of muscle memory, not just intellectual understanding. As they walked to the car through the rain-soaked streets of Washington, Jim made his decision. He would teach, not just through the documentary, but in person, would go to the schools, would stand in front of classrooms full of young officers and make them understand that this was not academic, was not theoretical, was life and death and the difference between bringing people home or sending letters to their families. He would show them Thomas Hartmann's journal, would let them read the words of a man who had learned in Belgian snow what it cost to wait for perfect, would show them the faces of Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen, would make them understand that these were not just names on a casualty list, but men with families and futures that ended because one officer thought he could plan away chaos. And he would tell them about Tiger II, would show them how the same mistake had been made across 80 years, how pride and perfectionism and the worship of technology had killed German soldiers in 1944 and American Marines in 2003, how the pattern repeated because each generation thought it was different, smarter, better equipped to achieve perfection. That would be his mission now, his final operation, the last thing he could do to honor the dead and protect the living. Bill would have approved, would have insisted on it, would have been right there beside him if cancer had not claimed him first. They reached the car. Jim paused before getting in, looking back at the press club where the documentary had premiered, where the lesson had been taught to 300 people who would carry it forward, where the covenant had been renewed for another generation. The rain had stopped. Clouds were breaking up, letting through pale sunset light. Somewhere in that building, workers were breaking down the equipment, closing up for the night. The moment was ending, but the impact would continue, would ripple outward through the military, would save lives that would never know they had been saved, would prevent mistakes that would never be made because the cost of making them had been paid by others. That was the covenant. That was the promise. That was why Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen had not died for nothing. Their deaths had purchased wisdom for a generation that would never know their names, but would live because of their sacrifice. Jim got in the car. Sarah drove. Marcus followed in his own vehicle. They headed home through the rain-washed streets, leaving behind the National Press Club and the documentary and the audience that had witnessed the teaching of a terrible truth. But the truth came with them, would always come with them, was written on Jim's soul in letters that would never fade. And tomorrow he would begin the work of writing it on other souls, of teaching other officers, of making sure that the next time an American commander faced the choice between perfection and pragmatism, they would choose correctly, would choose life, would choose their people over their plans. The covenant demanded it, the dead deserved it, and Jim Hartmann, who had learned the hard way that perfection was a trap, would spend whatever time he had left making sure that others learned the easy way, learn from his blood instead of spilling their own, learn from his mistakes instead of making their own. That was the mission, and Jim had never failed to complete a mission, not twice, not when it mattered this much, not when the lives of the next generation hung in the balance. He would teach, he would remind, he would ensure that the Iron Covenant held, that each generation learned from the last, that the dead were honored by protecting the living. That was his promise. That was his purpose. That was why he was still here, still fighting, still carrying the weight of command long after he had retired from active service. Some missions never ended. Some promises lasted a lifetime. And some lessons were too important to trust to chance or hope or the assumption that people would figure it out on their own. The rain began again as they drove through the Virginia suburbs toward home. But Jim barely noticed. His mind was already planning, already organizing, already preparing for the next phase of his final operation. The phase where he took the lesson from the screen to the classroom, where he made it real for young officers who had never heard a shot fired in anger. He would make them understand, would make them feel the weight of command, would make them grasp that perfection was not worth the price, that good enough was often better than perfect, that being there mattered more than being best. And if he did his job right, some of them would listen, some of them would learn, some of them would make different choices than he had made. Better choices, choices that brought their people home instead of sending them to Arlington. That was the goal. That was the hope. That was the reason Bill had pushed so hard to finish the documentary before he died, because he knew that Jim would take it further, would not stop with just one premiere, one audience, one night of teaching, would make it a crusade, a mission, a final service to the Corps and the country and the young warriors who would carry the flag forward. The covenant was renewed. The promise was kept. The teaching had begun, And Jim Hartmann, who had failed once at terrible custom, would not fail again, could not fail again. The dead deserved better. The living needed better, and he would give it to them or die trying. That was his vow. That was his purpose. That was the weight he would carry until his own name joined the others on the white stones of Arlington. But not yet. Not until the mission was complete. Not until the lesson stuck. Not until the next generation understood that perfection was the enemy and that the warriors who came home were the ones who figured that out before it was too late. The classroom at Marine Corps University in Quantico smelled of floor polish and anticipation. 50 young officers sat in neat rows, their dress uniforms crisp, their notebooks open, their faces reflecting that peculiar mixture of eagerness and wariness that marked junior leaders who were still learning what command really meant. Jim Hartmann stood at the front of the room, 70 years old now, 2 years after the documentary premiere. His hair was completely white. His hands showed the tremor of age. But his voice remained strong, carrying the weight of experience and the urgency of truth that needed telling. On the screen behind him, frozen on pause, was the image that had become synonymous with his teaching. Tiger II, serial number 2, 80040, sitting pristine and abandoned in Bavarian forest. Below it, a quote from his grandfather's journal, "Perfection has killed us." Good morning, gentlemen and ladies. I'm Colonel Hartmann, retired. I'm here to tell you about the most important tactical decision you'll ever make. Not in combat, right now, today, in this classroom. The decision about whether you'll learn from other people's mistakes or insist on making your own. The room was silent, attentive. These officers had all watched the documentary as required preparation, had read the case studies, had discussed the Tiger II parallel in their previous classes. But this was different. This was the man himself, the officer who had made the mistake and lived with the consequences and spent the remainder of his career trying to prevent others from repeating it. Jim clicked the remote. The screen changed to show 4 faces, young men in dress blues. Rodriguez, Jenkins, Washington, Chen. These Marines died under my command on March 27th, 2003. They died because I was so afraid of making mistakes that I made the worst mistake possible. I waited for perfect conditions. The enemy used my waiting to prepare an ambush. My caution killed them as surely as if I had pulled the trigger myself. He let that statement hang in the air, watched it land, saw the discomfort ripple through the audience. Good. Discomfort meant they were paying attention, meant the lesson might stick. Today's class has 3 learning objectives. First, you will understand why Tiger II lost World War II for Germany, despite being the best tank ever built. Second, you will understand how I repeated that mistake in Iraq with different equipment, but identical thinking. Third, you will make a choice about which kind of officer you want to be, the kind who learns from history or the kind who becomes history. Jim moved away from the podium, walking among the seats, making eye contact, turning this from lecture into conversation. Who here has read the after-action reports from Operation Iraqi Freedom? Most hands went up. Who has read the German armored doctrine from World War II? Fewer hands, but still a majority. Who has read my grandfather's journal? All hands. The journal had been digitized and included in the course materials. Good. Then you know the facts. Now I'm going to teach you what the facts mean, because facts without understanding are just data, and data gets people killed. He returned to the front, clicked through several slides showing Tiger II specifications. Armor thickness, gun penetration, engine power, all impressive, all superior to any Allied tank, all irrelevant to the outcome of the war. The Germans built 489 of these. Each one took 350,000 man-hours to construct. Do the math, that's 170 million man-hours total. In the same time, they could have built 6,000 Panthers, or 11,000 Panzer IVs, or 17,000 Stoogie 3s. Any of which would have been more effective because they could be sustained in the field, supplied with parts, and crewed by available personnel. A hand went up. Young lieutenant, female, sharp eyes. Sir, but doesn't quality eventually overcome quantity? If each Tiger II could destroy multiple Allied tanks, doesn't that offset the production cost? Jim smiled. The question showed she was thinking, not just absorbing. Excellent question, Lieutenant. Let's examine that assumption. Tiger II averaged 5 to 7 kills before being lost. Sounds impressive, but only 30% were lost to enemy action. 40% were abandoned due to mechanical failure or lack of fuel. Another 30% were destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. So most of Germany's super tanks never contributed to the war effort at all. They just consumed resources. He clicked to the next slide, a graph showing Tiger II availability rates over time. The line started at 70% and steadily declined to below 40% by war's end. This is the real story: availability, sustainability, being there when needed. Tiger II was amazing when it worked, but it worked less than half the time. Meanwhile, Sherman availability was above 85%. T-34 was above 80%. They were there. Tiger II usually wasn't, and in war, presence matters more than perfection. On the other hand, older captain, infantry background based on his insignia. Sir, with respect, we're not Germany in 1944. We have the logistics. We have the industrial base. We have the training infrastructure. Can't we sustain high-end equipment where they couldn't? Jim nodded. The question was predictable. He had heard variations of it in every class he taught. That's what I thought too, Captain. That's what every generation thinks. We're different. We're better. We won't make their mistakes, but let me show you something. He clicked to footage from Afghanistan, American vehicles, including several Abrams, sitting abandoned beside a mountain road. August 2010. These Abrams were left behind during a tactical withdrawal. Not destroyed, not captured, abandoned. Because in that terrain, with those logistics challenges, recovering them would have cost more than they were worth. We had the best tank in the world, and it became a liability. Why so? Because we designed it for a different war. Optimized it for open terrain and conventional enemies. And when the war changed, our perfect tank became an imperfect solution. The captain nodded slowly, understanding dawning. The lesson isn't that high-end equipment is bad, Jim continued. The lesson is that equipment optimized for perfect conditions becomes vulnerable when conditions aren't perfect. And conditions are never perfect. That's war. That's reality. That's what I forgot in Iraq. He clicked to the next section. Combat footage from March 2003. His own battalion. The chaos and confusion and desperate fighting that resulted from a plan meeting reality. My plan was textbook. Every staff college in the country would have given it top marks. Perfect coordination, perfect timing, perfect synchronization of assets. There was just one problem. The enemy didn't care about my perfect plan. They adapted to it, used my predictability against me, turned my strength into weakness. And 4 Marines died as a result. Jim's voice caught slightly. Even after all these years, the emotion was still there. Still raw, still painful. I'm going to show you something now that's difficult to watch. This is the moment I had to choose between my perfect plan and my son's life. The moment when all my training and all my doctrine and all my confidence in my own planning ability ran headfirst into the reality that war doesn't care about any of that. He played the footage, the command vehicle interior. Young Jim staring at the map while radio calls for help came in. The agonizing 10 seconds of hesitation. Bill's voice off camera. The decision to break the plan, and the consequences that followed. When the footage ended, Jim spoke quietly. I saved my son. I'm grateful for that. But I did it by breaking my own plan, and that breaking created the vulnerability that got 4 other men killed. So the question I've wrestled with for 23 years is this. Was I wrong to wait 6 days, creating the conditions for the ambush? Or was I wrong to break the plan when my son was in danger? And the answer I finally arrived at is that both were wrong, because both came from the same flawed thinking. The belief that I could eliminate chaos through planning, that I could make war predictable through preparation, that I could achieve perfection through discipline. He looked around the room. Every eye was on him. Every face was somber. They were getting it, understanding not just intellectually but viscerally. This was not academic. This was life and death. Their future decisions. Their future mistakes or successes. War is chaos. Command is uncertainty. Your job is not to eliminate either. Your job is to operate effectively despite both. That means planning, yes. Preparing, absolutely. Training until skills become instinct. But it also means staying flexible. Adapting when the plan fails. Accepting a good enough when perfect isn't achievable. And understanding that the enemy is trying to survive just as hard as you are, which means they're adapting too. A hand went up. Young lieutenant, male, armor branch based on his insignia. Sir, how do we know when to stick to the plan and when to abandon it? That seems like the critical question, but I don't see how we can know until it's too late. Jim walked over to stand directly in front of the lieutenant. You're asking for a formula, a rule, something clear and definable that will tell you the right answer every time. I understand why. We all want that certainty, but there is no formula. There's only judgment, and judgment comes from experience. And experience comes from making mistakes and learning from them. The question is whether you make your own mistakes or learn from mine. He returned to the front of the room. Let me give you a framework, not a rule, but a way of thinking. When you're planning an operation, ask yourself 3 questions. First, what assumptions is my plan making about enemy behavior? Second, what happens if those assumptions are wrong? Third, am I building flexibility into the plan so I can adapt when they prove wrong? Jim clicked through slides showing his Iraq planning documents. The assumptions clearly marked, the contingencies outlined, the places where flexibility should have been built in, but wasn't. I assumed the enemy would remain fixed, would not adapt, would not observe my 6-day preparation and reposition accordingly. Those were terrible assumptions, and I should have questioned them, but I didn't, because I was so focused on making my plan perfect that I forgot to make it resilient. Perfect but brittle breaks under pressure. Good enough but flexible bends and survives. Another hand, senior captain, probably 35. Sir, you mentioned your son learned from your mistake and applied the lessons successfully. Can you tell us about that? Jim's face softened, pride mixed with relief, mixed with gratitude. Marcus commanded a battalion in Eastern Europe last year, faced a similar decision point. Enemy maneuvering, intelligence incomplete, logistics stretched. He could wait for perfect information or act on good enough. He chose to act, not recklessly, not without planning, but he accepted that good enough was sufficient and moved while he still had initiative. Result, mission success, 0 casualties. He learned from my failure. That's the covenant. That's why I teach. So his success can teach you without you needing to first experience my failure. Jim advanced to the final section of his presentation. Images of Thomas Hartmann's journal. The entries about Mike O'Brien, about waiting for perfect conditions, about the promise made on Christmas Day, 1944. My grandfather learned this lesson 80 years ago, wrote it down, left it for me. I read it but didn't understand it, thought I was smarter, better trained, more capable. I was wrong, and men died because of my arrogance. Now I'm leaving it for you. The question is whether you'll understand it now or whether you'll need to pay the same price I paid to learn it. He looked at each face in the room, saw the understanding, saw the commitment, saw the determination to be better than he had been. You're about to receive your first commands. Some of you will lead infantry platoons. Some will command tank platoons. Some will lead aviation elements or logistics units. The equipment will vary. The mission will vary. But one thing will not vary. You will face moments when your plan meets reality and they don't match. When that happens, remember this class. Remember Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen. Remember that perfection is not achievable and pursuing it can kill the people depending on you. He clicked to the final slide. A quote, white text on black background. The best weapon is not the one with the thickest armor or the biggest gun. The best weapon is the one that's there when you need it. The best plan is not the one with 0 risk. The best plan is the one you can execute before the enemy executes theirs. The best officer is not the one who never loses people. The best officer is the one who doesn't lose them for nothing. Below the quote, Sergeant Thomas Hartmann, 2nd Armored Division, December 1944. That's my grandfather's wisdom, purchased with his friend's life. I'm giving it to you for free. All I ask in return is that you remember it, that you apply it, that you become the kind of officers who bring their people home instead of explaining to their families why they won't be coming home. Jim closed his presentation. The room was silent for a long moment. Then the senior Marine in the back, a major supervising the course, began to clap. Others joined. Not the thunderous applause of the documentary premiere, but something quieter and deeper. The applause of recognition, of commitment, of warriors acknowledging a truth that would shape how they led. When it ended, Jim spoke one more time. I'll be here for another hour if anyone wants to talk individually. Ask questions you didn't want to ask in front of the group. Challenge my conclusions. Tell me I'm wrong. I've been teaching this class for 2 years now, reached over 3,000 officers, and every time someone teaches me something new, shows me an angle I hadn't considered, helps me refine the lesson. That's the covenant too. We teach each other, learn from each other, make each other better. The class was dismissed. Most students left, needing time to process. But a dozen stayed behind, forming a loose circle around Jim, questions ready. The young lieutenant who had asked about quantity versus quality spoke first. "Sir, I'm heading to my first platoon command in 3 months. I'm terrified. Terrified I'll make a mistake. Terrified I'll get someone killed. How do you live with that fear?" Jim smiled sadly. "You don't. Not completely. The fear is appropriate. It means you understand the stakes. The key is not letting the fear paralyze you. I let fear drive me toward perfectionism. Thought that if I planned well enough, was careful enough, disciplined enough, I could eliminate risk. But risk can't be eliminated, Lieutenant. Only managed. Your job is to make the best decisions you can with the information you have, and then live with the consequences. Some of those consequences will be painful, but they'll be less painful if you stay flexible than if you stay rigid." Another officer, a captain with a combat experience based on his ribbons, asked the harder question. "Sir, what if we do everything right and people still die? What if we follow your advice, stay flexible, adapt to conditions, and still take casualties? How do we know the difference between acceptable losses and avoidable losses?" Jim met his eyes. The captain had seen combat, had probably already made hard decisions. This question came from experience, not theory. "You never know for certain, Captain. That's the burden of command. You'll second-guess every decision for the rest of your life. The question to ask yourself is not, could I have prevented this? Because the answer is almost always yes in hindsight. The question is, did I make the best decision I could with the information I had at the time? If the answer is yes, if you acted in good faith with sound judgment, then you did your job. The casualties are tragedy, but they're not fault. But if you made a decision based on pride or fear or the need to look good rather than be effective, then yes, those casualties are on you, and you'll carry them forever." He paused, deciding whether to share the next part, then decided these officers deserved the whole truth. "I still dream about Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen. Still wake up some nights seeing their faces. Still wonder if maybe, just maybe, there was something else I could have done. But I've made peace with it because I know my mistake. I know why they died. I know what I did wrong. And I've spent 23 years trying to make their deaths mean something by teaching others. That's how you live with it, Captain. You honor them by learning from them, by making sure their sacrifice teaches the next generation, by turning tragedy into wisdom." The questions continued. Technical, philosophical, personal. Jim answered them all, drawing on decades of experience and 2 decades of reflection. This was his mission now, his purpose, the work that gave meaning to his remaining years. After an hour, the last student left. Jim was alone in the classroom, packing up his materials, preparing for the drive back to his hotel. Tomorrow, he would teach the same class to a different group. Next week at Fort Benning. The week after, at Fort Leavenworth. An endless circuit of military education facilities, teaching the same lesson in different words to different audiences who all needed to hear it. His phone buzzed. Text from Marcus. "How did it go, Dad?" Jim typed back. "Good group. Asked hard questions. I think they got it." Marcus's response came quickly. "They always get it when you teach, because you're not teaching theory. You're teaching truth. Love you, Dad." Jim smiled, pocketing the phone. Marcus was commanding a regiment now. Full colonel. On track for brigade command. Leading thousands of Marines and doing it well because he had learned from Jim's failures. That was worth everything. That made the pain bearable. He left the classroom, walked through the corridors of Marine Corps University. On the walls hung portraits of legendary Marines. Chesty Puller, John Basilone, Dan Daly, men who had become legends through their actions in combat. Jim would never be among them. His portrait would never hang in these halls. His legacy would not be victory, but wisdom. Not triumph, but teaching. Not glory, but the quiet prevention of mistakes that would never be made because he had made them first. That was enough, more than enough. It had to be. Outside, the Virginia afternoon was warm and clear. Spring was giving way to early summer. The trees around Quantico were full and green, life continuing, seasons changing, the world moving forward while Jim remained anchored to a day 23 years past. But maybe that was appropriate. Maybe someone needed to stay anchored to that day, to remember, to teach, to ensure that Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen were not forgotten, that their deaths continued to have meaning long after their names faded from memory. Jim drove back to his hotel, mind already preparing for tomorrow's class. Different audience, same lesson. The endless repetition that was teaching. The slow, patient work of changing minds one classroom at a time. It was not glamorous, not exciting, not the kind of work that made headlines or earned medals, but it was important, more important than any tactical victory, because it was preventing future defeats. That night, in his hotel room, Jim opened his laptop and read through the latest batch of emails. Letters from former students, updating him on their careers, thanking him for the teaching, sharing their own experiences applying the lessons. Some had faced their own crisis moments. Some had made good decisions. A few had made mistakes, though none as costly as Jim's, and had written seeking advice on how to process the guilt. Jim responded to each one personally, offering encouragement, providing perspective, reminding them that mistakes were inevitable, but learning from them was optional, that the goal was not perfection, but progression, not flawless execution, but constant improvement. One email stood out, from a young lieutenant who had been in Jim's class 6 months earlier. She was writing from Afghanistan, where her platoon had just survived an ambush. She credited Jim's teaching with her decision to break from the planned route when her instincts said something was wrong. 3 vehicles instead of 5 because she had trusted her judgment over the plan. The 2 vehicles that followed the original route hit IEDs. Would have been 5 if she had stayed rigid. I thought of your grandfather's journal, she wrote. Thought of Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen. Thought about how you said the best plan is the one you can abandon when it's wrong. So I abandoned mine, and my Marines are alive because of it. Thank you for teaching me that perfection is the enemy. Thank you for paying the price so I didn't have to. Jim read the email 3 times, felt tears on his face. This was why he taught, why he traveled, why he stood in front of classroom after classroom telling the same painful story. Because somewhere, somehow, it was saving lives. The lesson was sticking. The covenant was holding. The dead were teaching the living. He typed a response. Lieutenant, congratulations on bringing your Marines home. That's the only metric that matters. You trusted your judgment over your plan, and that's exactly right. The plan is a tool, not a scripture. Your instincts, shaped by training and experience, are what keep people alive. I'm proud of you. Your Marines are lucky to have you. Stay safe, stay flexible, and keep learning. The war will keep teaching if you keep listening. He sent the email and closed the laptop. Tomorrow would bring another class, another 50 officers who needed to hear the lesson. Another opportunity to honor the dead by protecting the living. And he would do it, would keep doing it as long as he had breath and strength and voice to teach. Because that was the covenant. Each generation learning from the last. Each mistake teaching future successes. Each death purchasing wisdom for those who came after. It was not glorious, but it was necessary. And Jim Hartmann, who had learned the hard way that perfection was a trap, would keep teaching the easy way for as long as he possibly could. 6 months later, Jim stood in a different classroom. This one at the Army War College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. The students were older, more experienced. Lieutenant colonels and colonels being prepared for strategic command. They had all seen combat, all made hard decisions, all lost people. Teaching them was different. They did not need to be convinced that war was chaos. They knew. They did not need to be told that plans failed. They had lived it. What they needed was framework, perspective, the wisdom to take their tactical experience and apply it strategically. Jim's presentation had evolved. Less focus on the individual combat decisions, more on the systemic factors that had led to Tiger II and to his own Iraq failure. The organizational culture that rewarded perfection over pragmatism. The promotion system that valued flawless execution over adaptive innovation. The doctrine that emphasized planning over flexibility. The problem with Tiger II was not the tank, Jim told this more senior audience. The problem was the system that built it. The strategic culture that valued technological superiority over sustainable effectiveness. The leadership that confused excellence with wisdom. When you take command at brigade or division level, you'll be shaping that culture for thousands of subordinates. The question is what culture you'll create, one that encourages adaptation or one that demands perfection. A colonel in the front row, clearly skeptical, raised his hand. Sir, with respect, doesn't the modern battlefield require more precision, not less? We have guided munitions, real-time intelligence, network-centric warfare. Shouldn't we be pursuing perfection through technology rather than accepting good enough? Jim had been expecting this question. Got it in every war college class. Colonel, technology doesn't eliminate chaos. It just changes the kind of chaos you face. Yes, we have precision weapons. We also have enemies who adapt to precision weapons by dispersing, by hiding among civilians, by using our precision as a weakness. Yes, we have real-time intelligence. We also have enemies who know we have it and use that knowledge to deceive us. Every technological advantage creates new vulnerabilities. That's not an argument against technology. It's an argument for staying adaptable in how we employ technology. He clicked through slides showing the evolution of insurgent tactics in Iraq and Afghanistan, how enemies adapted to American technological advantages, how they turned precision into a handicap by making every target uncertain, how they used network connectivity against American forces by exploiting predictable communication patterns. The lesson from Tiger II is not that quality is bad. It's that quality without sustainability loses to adequacy with persistence. In strategic terms, that means building a military that can adapt faster than enemies can innovate, not building a military so perfect that it can't afford to take risks or accept casualties. Because a military that won't risk failure is a military that can't achieve victory. The skeptical colonel nodded slowly, not fully convinced, but thinking. That was enough. Jim was not trying to convert everyone. Just plant seeds, make them question assumptions, encourage them to think beyond doctrine to the reality underneath. After the class, the colonel approached Jim privately. Sir, I appreciate what you're trying to teach, but I worry that emphasizing flexibility over planning will lead to cowboy tactics. Junior leaders making it up as they go, without proper coordination or preparation. Jim respected the concern. It was legitimate. Colonel, there's a difference between flexibility and chaos, between adaptation and recklessness. What I'm advocating is not abandoning planning. It's holding plans lightly, building in decision points where you can adjust based on enemy reaction, creating a culture where subordinates feel empowered to modify the plan when conditions change, not paralyzed by fear of deviating from the commander's intent. How do we balance that with the need for coordination, for synchronized operations? By being clear about what must be synchronized and what can be decentralized. Some things require perfect timing, air support windows, artillery coordination. Those need to be locked in. But the route to the objective, the exact method of assault, those can be flexible. The key is distinguishing between constraints that matter and constraints that are just habit. The colonel considered this. I'm taking over a brigade next month. I'll think about how to apply this. That's all I ask, sir. Think about it. Question assumptions. Build flexibility where it makes sense. And remember that the officers under your command will mirror your values. If you reward adaptation, they'll adapt. If you punish deviation from the plan regardless of outcome, they'll become rigid. Culture flows from the top. They shook hands. The colonel left. Jim packed up his materials, satisfied. He would not know if his words made a difference, would not see whether that colonel created a culture of adaptation or rigidity, but he had planted the seed, done his part. The rest was up to leaders who would face their own crises and make their own choices. That was teaching. That was the covenant. Plant seeds. Water them with truth. Hope they grew into wisdom. Jim's final class was scheduled for Fort Benning, Georgia, 3 months from now. After that, he would retire from teaching. 71 was old enough. Time to step back. Let younger voices carry the message forward. Marcus had volunteered to take over some of the teaching. Other veterans from Iraq and Afghanistan were stepping up as well. The lesson would continue, the covenant would hold. But before he stopped, there was one more thing he needed to do, one more promise to keep. He needed to return to Arlington, to Bill's grave, to report that the mission was complete. On a cool October morning, Jim made the drive to Arlington National Cemetery. The leaves were turning gold and red. The air had that crisp quality that marked autumn in Virginia. He parked and walked the familiar path to Bill's grave. 2 years had passed since he was last here. 2 years of teaching, 2 years of traveling, 2 years of telling the same story to different audiences. Over 5,000 officers trained, hundreds of emails from students applying the lessons, at least 3 confirmed instances where his teaching had directly prevented casualties. That was the scoreboard. 3 lives saved for everyone lost in Iraq. It did not balance the scales, could never balance them. But it meant something. Meant the deaths had not been wasted. Meant Rodriguez and Jenkins and Washington and Chen had contributed to something larger than their individual tragedies. Jim knelt at Bill's grave. The headstone was weathered now. The flowers Helen left had long since faded, but the inscription remained clear. Beloved friend, faithful Marine, devoted teacher. I kept my promise, brother, Jim said quietly. The documentary reached over 200,000 views online. The classes reached over 5,000 officers. The lesson is being taught. The covenant is holding. You can rest now. He placed a small object on the grave, a challenge coin, not the standard Marine Corps coin, but one specially made. On one side, the image of Tiger II. On the other, the names of the 4 fallen Marines. Around the edge, the words, "Excellence without wisdom is just expensive failure." Marcus made these, had 1,000 struck, gives them to every officer in his regiment. Reminder of what we learned, what you helped us teach. You'd be proud of him, Bill. He's twice the officer I ever was, 3 times the teacher. Your last mission succeeded beyond what either of us imagined. Jim stood, joints protesting. Age was catching up. The travel was becoming harder. The standing for hours teaching was taking its toll. Time was finite, but the work was done. The lesson was taught. The next generation of teachers was ready. He looked around Arlington at the endless rows of white stones, each one a story, each one a lesson, each one a reminder that freedom was not free and wisdom was not cheap. How many of these graves held men who had died learning lessons that were already known? How many families had paid for wisdom that someone else had already purchased? That was why Jim taught, why he traveled, why he told his painful story over and over. Because every officer who learned from his mistake was one less grave in Arlington, one less family destroyed, one less lesson written in blood. The sun broke through clouds, illuminating the cemetery in golden light. Jim took a photo of Bill's grave with the challenge coin, would send it to Helen tonight, would let her know that her husband's final work continued to save lives, that his sacrifice, like those of the 4 Marines, had meaning that extended far beyond the moment of death. As Jim walked back to his car, he passed other graves, other wars, other generations who had learned their own lessons. Korea, Vietnam, Desert Storm, the pattern repeating across decades. But maybe, just maybe, with each iteration, the lesson stuck a little better. The wisdom spread a little further. The next generation paid a little less for knowledge the previous generation had already acquired. That was the hope. That was the covenant. That was why warriors like Jim and Bill dedicated their final years to teaching, because the alternative was unacceptable. The alternative was letting the pattern continue unchanged. The alternative was more graves, more grieving families, more young men and women dying for lessons that should have already been learned. But Jim was not ready to leave Arlington yet. There was one more place he needed to visit, one more piece of the story that needed witnessing. He drove the short distance to the cemetery's memorial amphitheater, then walked to the nearby display area where military vehicles were preserved. And there, under an aluminum shelter, sat the reason he had come. Tiger II, serial number 2, 80040. The same tank he had shown in 1,000 presentations. The same machine he had used to teach 5,000 officers. But Jim had never stood before it after completing his mission, had never faced it as a man who had finally, truly understood what it represented. The tank sat massive and silent, its 68 tons of steel and pride preserved for posterity. Someone had recently cleaned it. The late afternoon sun caught the edges of the thick armor plates, making them gleam. The long barrel of the 8.8 centimeter gun pointed toward the sky, still intimidating 80 years after it was forged. Jim walked slowly around the tank, his footsteps echoing on the concrete pad. He reached out and touched the cold steel of the Glacier's plate, 150 millimeters thick, sloped at 50 degrees, impenetrable by any Allied gun when fired from the front. Perfect, and utterly defeated. The metal was cold under his palm. He could feel the slight roughness where decades had weathered the finish. Somewhere inside this machine, a German crew had sat, believing that their technical superiority would save them. They had been wrong, just as Jim had been wrong 70 years later in different desert with a different tank. He moved to the side of the vehicle, to a small plaque that had been installed in recent months. His own words approved by the Cemetery Commission etched in bronze. Tiger II, the most dangerous enemy. Not this machine, but the thinking that built it. The belief that perfection can overcome reality. The pride that says excellence requires no compromise. 489 were built. Thousands of simpler vehicles were not. Germany lost the war. In memory of all warriors who learned this lesson in blood, and in hope that future generations will learn it in wisdom instead, Colonel James Hartmann, USMC returned, and the 4 Marines who taught him, SSgt David Rodriguez, Cpl James Jenkins, PFC Anthony Washington, Pvt Kevin Chen, March 27, 2003. Jim stood before the plaque for a long time, his reflection visible in the polished bronze. An old man, white-haired, weathered by years of carrying weight that could not be set down. Behind his reflection, the bulk of the Tiger loomed, a steel monument to lessons learned the hard way. A sound made him turn. A young Marine, couldn't be more than 20, stood at respectful distance. The kid wore utilities, probably stationed at the cemetery for honor guard duty. He held a clipboard but had stopped whatever task he'd been doing to stare at the tank. "Sir," the young Marine said, noticing Jim's attention, Is that the tank from the video? The one Colonel Patterson talked about before he died?" Jim felt something shift in his chest. The documentary had reached farther than he'd known. "It is, son." The Marine stepped closer, looking up at the massive vehicle with the mixture of awe and confusion that came from seeing history made tangible. "I watched that documentary in boot camp. Our instructor made us write an essay about it." The kid's voice carried the earnestness of youth. "I wrote about how the Germans thought technology would save them, how they built this instead of building more of what they could actually use." He paused, then looked at Jim. Are you Colonel Hartmann, sir?" "I am." The young Marine's eyes widened, then he snapped to attention. "Sir, I just want to say, my instructor, Staff Sergeant Chen, he said your teaching saved his life in Afghanistan. Said he remembered your words about good enough beating perfect when he had to make a choice about pursuing enemy fighters or protecting his squad. He chose his squad. They all came home." Jim's throat tightened. Another one. Another life touched. Another decision made better because of lessons learned in blood. "What's your name, Marine?" "Private Daniel Rodriguez, sir." Rodriguez. The same last name as one of the 4. Probably coincidence. Probably, but maybe the universe had a sense of poetry. "Private Rodriguez, do you understand what this tank represents?" The young man looked at the Tiger, thinking carefully before speaking. "Sir, I think it represents what happens when we forget that war is about people, not equipment. When we chase perfect instead of accepting good enough. When we let pride make our decisions instead of wisdom." Jim felt tears on his face but made no move to wipe them away. "Outstanding, Marine. You just earned an A on an essay you didn't know you were writing." He pulled out his wallet, withdrew one of the challenge coins Marcus had made, the ones with Tiger II on one side and the 4 names on the other. He pressed it into the young Marine's hand. "When you face your first real decision under fire, when perfect isn't an option and good enough is all you've got, remember this tank. Remember why it lost. And choose to be the Marine who comes home to teach the next generation instead of the Marine who becomes a lesson himself." Private Rodriguez stared at the coin, then at Jim, then snapped his sharpest salute. "Yes, sir, I will, sir." Jim returned the salute, then watched the young Marine walk away. The coin clutched tight in his fist like a talisman. Like truth made solid. The sun was setting now, painting Arlington in shades of gold and amber. The white headstones glowed in the fading light. The Tiger cast a long shadow across the concrete, its bulk silhouetted against the sky. Jim took one final look at the machine that had defined so much of his teaching, this perfect, defeated monument to pride and excellence in the fatal flaw of confusing the two. Then he turned away and walked toward the parking lot, toward his car, towards Sarah and home, and the peace of knowing his work would continue without him. Private Rodriguez would tell Staff Sergeant Chen about this meeting. Chen would tell others. The story would spread. The lesson would persist. That was the covenant. Each generation teaching the next. Each mistake preventing future errors. Each death purchasing wisdom that would save lives not yet born. Jim reached his car and paused with his hand on the door, looking back one last time. The Tiger sat in its shelter, perfect and preserved and utterly irrelevant to the wars being fought today. A museum piece, a warning, a teacher more effective in defeat than it ever was in combat. And standing before it in Jim's imagination, he could see them. Thomas Hartmann in his World War II tanker jacket, young and scared and learning. Bill Patterson in desert camouflage, pragmatic and wise and determined to save his friend from himself. Rodriguez, Jenkins, Washington, and Chen in their dress blues, forever young, forever teaching. And Marcus, leading the next generation forward with lessons learned from all of them. 3 generations of Hartmann tank commanders, 3 different wars, 3 different kinds of tanks. But one lesson, finally learned, finally taught, finally woven into the fabric of American military culture so deeply that a 20-year-old private could articulate it, standing before the very machine that embodied what not to do. Jim got in his car, started the engine. The radio came on, some country song about coming home. He turned it off, preferred the silence, the quiet after completion, the peace of a mission finally truly accomplished. As he drove through Arlington's gates for the last time, the sun disappeared below the horizon. Night came to the cemetery, to the city, to the story that had defined Jim's final decades. But somewhere in classrooms and training facilities across the country, the lesson continued. The teaching persisted. The covenant held. Perfection was the enemy. Adaptation was the goal. Being there mattered more than being best. And the warriors who came home were the ones who understood that truth before it was too late. That was Jim Hartmann's legacy. Not a statue or a building or a medal. Just a lesson taught so well that it would outlive him by generations. Just a truth, learned in pain and shared in hope. Just a promise kept to dead friends and fallen Marines and a grandfather who had written a warning 80 years ago that had finally been heard. Jim drove into the Virginia evening, toward home, toward rest, toward whatever time remained to him. Behind him, the Tiger sat in its eternal vigil, a steel reminder, a monument not to German engineering, but to American wisdom. Not to what should be built, but to what should be learned. The pattern was broken, the lesson was taught, the covenant was fulfilled. And in the gathering darkness of Arlington National Cemetery, if you listen carefully, you might hear the whisper of wind through the white stones, the voice of warriors across generations, speaking the truth that had cost so much to learn. The best weapon is the one that's there. The best plan is the one you can change. The best officer is the one who brings them home. Everything else is just details.